Welcome to Cool Explorations. I'm your host, Tony Peters. Today we're going to have on David Pollendine of International Justice Mission, and he's going to tell us his testimony, what God's been doing in his life and through the work that International Justice Mission does. And the verse that they've chosen to use for International Justice Mission is Micah 6:8, and that is, He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, to act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Very important verse, and you can find them at www.ijm.ca. Hello and welcome to Cool Explorations. I am your host, Tony Peters. Today we have David Pollendine on, and he's going to talk about International Justice Mission, or IJM. As we discussed in the prelude there, we will be looking at Micah 6:8 as a reference to all this kind of stuff we're going to be talking about here, which is fantastic. I'm looking forward to this stuff. And why don't you start off by telling us a little about who you are as a person, David?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. It's lovely to be here and to talk to you about the work of IGM and just to share a little bit as well about myself. So I'm originally, you can hear that I'm not from Canada. I'm from the UK. My family and I moved to Winnipeg 5 years ago now, 5.5 years ago. I'm married with two children, got a 16-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son. So two teenagers in the house. Which is wonderful. I always wanted teenagers. I always wanted that challenge. I've always loved youth work, been a youth worker in my past. So I'm delighted now to have my own kind of my youth work every day within my family, which is great. And yeah, so I originally come from the UK. I worked a lot actually in student ministry for a number of years, worked in the Czech Republic actually for 10 years doing student ministry, and then got involved in fundraising, worked for a few NGOs in London. For Christian Aid was one, and St John Ambulance was another, and just got into the whole world of fundraising. And so yeah, when I came to Canada, it was just a natural step to be able to start working for IGM as well in this kind of in this arena. And it was wonderful. Who'd have thought that I'd have found a job in Winnipeg? Coming from London, I thought, what am I going to do in Winnipeg? What can I do? Maybe street entertainment, maybe some, I can reinvent myself. But thankfully, God had a plan, and I was able to find work working in the prairies as a fundraiser. So now I'm the actually working as the national director for development growth within IGM. So it's become more of a national remit, which is great as well. So it's lovely to be here, and yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to talking about that. Before we get into that, why don't you tell us your testimony and how God's kind of helped you grow along the way to get you to where you are now?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a small town in England. Not really a town; it was really a village, but we did have a charter, so we were a town. We're about 3,000 people, and it was very similar to many small villages and towns across England. It was very secular. Nobody goes to church. We really are a secular country, so that was typical. Although we did have a big Anglican church that we used to sometimes go to as a cub and a scout on Remembrance Sunday and main holidays and things. But yeah, had no real exposure growing up to the sort of Christian faith. Mum and dad divorced when I was about 5, so that was quite traumatic, I think, for not just for us, for our parents as well. And so we lived with our mum and my nan. But my dad came to faith actually through that trauma of the divorce and stuff. And so he prayed for many years for us. So although we weren't actually living together, we didn't see too much of him in the early years, especially. But he just faithfully kept praying. So eventually, we were at university, and we went to his church in a place called Luton, and the pastor happened to be a football player, soccer player, and me and my brother loved football. So yeah, over the years we've been there a few times, and I heard this lovely Welsh evangelist share about Jesus and about a relationship that you could have with him, and so I went forward, and I was about 22, so that was in about 1989, I guess, 1988, 89. And so, yeah, made a decision, and it took, it was a gradual, it kind of gradually started to meet with Christians, started to go to church. Having not gone to church growing up, it took me a while to get into that rhythm. But yeah, so went to university and then discovered about how you can share your faith at university. And so that's why I got into working with what is kind of equivalent to InterVarsity over here, Christian Fellowship, but worked within that same kind of organization in what was actually Czechoslovakia when I first went there, but then it became the Czech Republic. So yeah, so that's kind of a very quick version of how I found faith, or
No,
faith found me.
it's interesting that you bring up that UK is very secular, because I had on a Christian musician from there too, and she said the exact same thing, where if she even brings up faith or anything with her friends, they will like right away shut her down, and some of them have even told her not to communicate with them because of that. And I'm just like, yeah, that sadly that's the way North America is heading. So I think it's important that we do the work that we're doing to reach people for with the faith and plant those seeds. So at IJM, you discussed your role a little bit. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that role and a little bit more about what International Justice Mission does and what they are as an organization.
Yeah. So IJM, we are actually with the largest anti-slavery organization in the world. Although we're not just solely focused on slavery, we're actually focused more on violence and or the threat of violence that people experience across the world, but especially in developing world amongst poor communities. And so we recognize that people in poverty especially just do not have access to justice. It's not that the access is poor or bad, it's that the access just is not there for many, many people. The UN came out with a figure of, which is staggering, but of 5 billion people not protected by the law, which when you think the earth is around 7 billion,
Wow.
5 billion is an incredible amount of people. It's over 2/3 of the population of the world. So again, it makes you realize that living here in Canada, we really are privileged. We live in privilege, and so for most people, they're either oppressed by violence or the fear of violence. It's not necessarily, it's that fear, it's that sense of insecurity, because if you are oppressed in some way, if you're robbed, if you're raped, whatever it is, that you just aren't going to get justice. And so you're then not just, it's not just justice, you're not just, the perpetrator's not just out there and free because there's impunity, but you're also imprisoned by the trauma that it impacts you from that, because you're also not going to get access to good trauma counseling as well. And in those contexts, you need money. You need money for a lawyer, you need money for trauma counseling. It's just not, it's not accessible in the same way that we have it here. So that's really why IJM exists. I could connect really back to the beginning, which was Gary Haugen, our founder, he was actually the chief investigator for the Rwandan genocide. So he was a 30-year-old high-flying lawyer with this incredible job, which was also very traumatic as well, where he basically had to log how people had been killed in the genocide.
Yeah, there's a lot.
So it was very traumatic. Yeah. And he was really struck by a couple of things. One was, where was the world when this was happening? And of course, I don't know if you remember, but the world was watching O.J. Simpson escape up the freeway.
Yeah.
Everyone's eyes was on that. It was live on TV in the UK as well. We were watching that chase. And so while that was happening, we had this horrific thing happening in Rwanda. The other question he asked as well is actually not just where was the world, but where was the church? And how could something like this happen? And one of the things he realized was that, no amount of prayer, no amount of good feeling or sermons or anything like that really could have changed or stopped what actually happened. And it needed actual physical intervention. It needed someone to actually take the machete out of the hands of the people. And as a lawyer, he recognized that, the law has the strength to do that, but it's not happening in many of these situations, in many of these countries, especially when it's poor communities. It just doesn't happen. And so he actually resigned and set up IJM, and everyone said, don't do it, you're mad, what are you doing, it'll never work. I mean, governments are too corrupt, it's just not going to work. And he did it one person at a time. He basically, one case at a time, he took that person in a collaborative way, working with lawyers, working with aftercare professionals, working with judiciary, and basically saying, look, we're going to take this person through the justice system, we're going to do good praxis. As we go through it, we're going to have to put holes in the pipeline, we're going to have to mend things, definitely, but we want to get them through the justice system out the other side. We want them to flourish, we want the perpetrator to go and go to prison for what they've done, and then we've got somebody who's actually come through and been protected. And so he just did that one person at a time, and it's developed. And 25 years later, we're this big organization working in 26 locations around the world, over 4 continents. So it was a vision that he had back then, and it was based on a theory of change, which is really simple, is that when you enforce the law, violence stops. And it really does work, and we've proved it again and again. It's that simple, especially where there's impunity, where you're in a place where you've got no fear of judgment, you've got no fear of being held accountable for what you're doing. Where somebody is prosecuted and sent to prison in that context, it has a big impact. It has a big impact. And we've seen that again and again in many different locations. We saw it in Uganda with land theft. So what would happen there is that often a lady would be married and her husband would pass away. Often the husband might be older, so he might have died because he's old, or might have died of AIDS or whatever, however he's died. And so she would be left on the property. But what would happen, and this is kind of a biblical story, we know the story of Boaz, that the name of the property would want to be kept in the name of the husband, to keep it in the family. Mm-hmm. And so if the woman's there on her own, they will want her to give up the land to the family. So they're scared that she might marry again and then it would go to another name. And so sometimes that means that they would intimidate her, they would burn her house down, they would kill the cattle, and they would even bring the machete onto her. So this was a crime which we'd been working with the police, working with the justice system, working with the community for like 10 years in Uganda, in a little area of Uganda. And we saw no convictions in 10 years. So for 10 years, every case that we brought to the court was thrown out. It just didn't work until 2000 and I think 14, 15. And we got our first prosecution. We got our first person sent to prison. And that was 2015. To date, we've had over 100 people sent to prison for that crime in that little area of Uganda. So it just takes one, it really does. And so that's what keeps us going. That's why we keep in that country. We keep working with the different stakeholders, the different actors, because we know that it works, but you've got to stick at it. You've got to keep at the plow. You can't you can't backtrack, but it will work in the end. The law at the end does come through.
Well, and we like to think that that kind of stuff doesn't happen here in North America or in the US or Canada, but we know the sex trade is very active here, and sex slavery, that's something we've seen presidents go after in the past, and some presidents are a lot more lax on that, but it does happen here as well. So that's something that I love to just mention, because it's important that we recognize that we are not better than these other countries. It's happening here, right in our own backyards.
Absolutely. It exists in every country. Slavery is an issue in every country, and there is no perfect justice system. Every justice system is flawed. some are just flawed more than others. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's a case of, and a lot of our work is based on capacity, and we want to, with the money that we are able to raise, we want to do as much as we can with it. So obviously we're keen to go to those places that are in most need, where there's most need.
Mhm.
In a perfect world, yeah, every system needs help in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you say, there is no perfect system, and I mean, governments, it's a struggle for them. How do they counter this? How do they put the funds into it? Because there's only so many things you
Yeah.
can put money into. So that is where it's great to have an organization like yours come in to provide that help and support, where a government might be struggling with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so tell us a little bit more about your own role in there, and as well as touch on Micah 6:8, because we brought that up in the intro, and I love that you tied that particular verse into the ministry that you guys do. So explain a little bit more how that ties in there.
Yeah, it's one of our key verses, I think, for the work of IJM. And I think certainly for Gary, I think it was really one of the verses that was when he was working in Rwanda, worked in that justice, in that work um, as the chief investigator. I think for him, he really saw. I think for the first time, he realized that, wait a minute, this work of justice is actually our job. Yes, God can intervene directly. Yes, we see miracles in the world, absolutely. But essentially, and Jesus kind of modeled this in his walk around the earth, is that he wants to do it through us. He wants to use us to be his tool of justice, if you like, to be his aroma on the earth. And I love also the idea of darkness and light. And that's something, I mean, Gary talks about that with his children. He's got a wonderful story about how his kids were afraid of the dark, and he'd charge the dark. He'd run into the dark screaming with them because he'd say that, because you run in there and then you realize, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it was, But I think that's the challenge as Christians, is that we are called to be in dark places, because that's where our light has the best impact, and the Bible talks about this all the time in many different places, where if a light is shining in a light place, it's not going to really make much difference, is it? You can hardly see the light on outside when in the day. It's at night when the light actually is seen. And so that's the challenge for us as Christians, living, especially when we're living in a comfortable society where life can be quite comfortable and easy. God's calling us to go into the dark with our light. And I think that is something I think Gary realized when he was on those, if you like, those fields in Rwanda, that this is our job. We've got to take responsibility and step up, and we've got to be the hands and the feet of Jesus. And actually that verse from Micah is wonderful, because it kind of is a little bit of a explanation of what Jesus did. You could literally put Jesus into, and it was the Lord that's requiring this of you. Ironically, it's the Lord that's requiring this of you, to act justly. What did Jesus do when he was on the world? Oh, he acted justly, to love mercy. Well, Jesus loved mercy. We see that in the way he talked, the Good Samaritan. We saw it in the way that he treated people, people who are very different to himself. And of course, he walked humbly with his Father. Nobody's walked humbly as Jesus. Nobody argues when he says, I am humble. Nobody argues with that.
Yeah.
only he could say that and get away with it, So I think he's left that model for us, and we really are to be his hands and his feet. And that's why, IGM is a community of Christian lawyers, of aftercare professionals, of of different people working in the justice system to make a change, because that is our commission. Yeah, the Great Commission absolutely is to go into the world and to preach the gospel, but we are to be it as well in the way that the way that we shine our light and the way that we lead. So I think that's really important. I think Micah it's just so beautiful. And actually, I think it's in Matthew, Jesus picks that up again. He almost quotes the same words because he challenges the Pharisees, doesn't he? And he says, you know, he challenges them because they're not acting according to how they were supposed to be acting. Well, how should they act? Oh, they also needed to do the same, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly, so it's great that Jesus quotes that and brings it into the New Testament as well, that nothing's changed. It's
Yeah.
still the mandate for us to do
Yeah.
that. So yeah, I think it's great. And we were talking about this just pre to us coming on air, but how when you are walking in the thing that God has you to do, it's just wonderful, and it gives you a peace that you're doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is. Sometimes it can be hard, but
Oh
if you
yeah.
know you're in that place and you're doing the right thing, then you have a peace about what you're doing, and it's not hard work, even though
Yeah.
it can be sometimes frightening and scary, but you have an inner peace. So I think that's definitely, that kind of is all of that is encapsulated in Micah 6:8, and it's become, really through working with IJM, it's become one of my favorite verses now in the Bible, definitely, and especially as Jesus picks it up as well to challenge the Pharisees in the way that they're doing things.
Yeah, and it's kind of a two-part verse because it does two things. It's that call to action, like you're
Yeah,
talking about,
yeah,
and it's that guide. It's that telling you this is how you should be going
yeah,
about this. And so I love that it encapsulates both in that verse. It not only calls you to action, but it tells you exactly how you
yeah,
should be acting. And I think that is very important for people to recognize. Uh,
yeah,
and as they go through, and like you say, I love when he challenges the Pharisees. It just, the hypocrisy is just so
yeah,
blatant for us looking at it. And
yeah,
it would have been hard for them to take it because it's, I mean, someone's calling you out. It's,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
That's right. And they were powerful, weren't they? They were all powerful, and how dare this person
yeah, yeah.
challenge them.
Well, and we were talking too about how some of these Pharisees weren't even Levites anymore. Like they weren't the people that were supposed to be
Mm,
leading were supposed to be those of the Levite tribe. Those are the priests. But a
mm,
lot of the people who were taking these positions of power were no longer Levites. They were
yeah,
just people in the church or church synagogue who were like, oh, I've risen up to this place. My family name has given me this place. And that's where Jesus really just was like, no,
yeah,
this is how you're supposed to act. And that's what
yeah,
really got ruffled their feathers on many occasions.
yeah,
And the fact that he came from humble beginnings,
yeah,
a carpenter's son. I mean,
yeah.
how can
From
they how could they
from
possibly
Nazareth.
know? Yeah, and how could they possibly know more than I? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also what he does, he's quite, but he does this a few times. He does it with Nicodemus as well, actually. But he says, you're supposed to know this. It's like, do you not know? Have you not forgotten? I think he actually says that. Have you not forgotten what the most important thing is in the law? It's to love, it's to
yeah,
love justice, walk humbly. And so it kind of calls them out, that makes them yeah, realize that you should know this. If you're an expert in the law, you're well read, how
yeah,
come you don't know this? And so it almost, it really does bring them down.
yeah.
You can see why they got angry.
Well, and I've respected there's a few of the Sadducees and Pharisees that I reading in the Bible I have a lot of respect for because they came to know Christ as their savior, and it's like
Yeah,
you know how difficult that would have been for someone in their position.
oh yeah.
Like,
And I, yeah, and in some ways we experience with the work of IGM. We've got people, I'm a fundraiser, but working in the field doing the work, at a sacrifice, because there is a risk, there is a risk there to themselves. especially working within, higher up within, whether it's in government or
Yeah.
in police. So I mean, I think it is. But again, it comes back to that, whether you feel, do you feel you're in the right place where, and God puts us in sometimes difficult places, but there's that inner peace. I think that's really important
Yeah. And I
that
love
we
that
feel that. Yeah.
there's a song out there. Oh, I have it on my thing. I forget the name of it, but it says that it was never promised that it would be easy. And I'm just
Yeah.
like, that is so true. He
Yeah.
never promises it's going to be easy. In fact, he
Yeah.
promises the exact opposite, that we're going to go through trials and hardship.
Sure.
And so I see that even with people who are coming to Christ through IJM or through many other organizations. They're coming from these difficult backgrounds. How
Sure.
does IJM put in place support programs for people? What kind of support programs do they have, and how do they go about putting them in place?
Yeah. We've recently actually opened a few new offices in the past year, I guess. With, um, really reaching out to the government. We can't work in any country unless we have an agreement with the government. So there are countries we just can't work in. We've not been able be able to find that agreement, if you like. So that's the first thing. There is a limit to where we can go. Thankfully, that's a minority of places. There's still a lot of places where we can work with government, and where government really have a desire for things to change. So just like our government, there's no perfect government. So we have to acknowledge that we're not going to be necessarily in a place where we're going to be working with a perfect system. But we can make inroads with people who also have that same heart for justice and for making the world better in their country and context. So yeah, we always have to have an agreement with the government. We sign a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, and it also needs agreement that there is a actual problem in a particular area. And that's hard. Sometimes that is hard for us as well to admit, yes, we have an issue with this and we need help. So that's also an important part of what we do. Now, the work then is really data driven. We can't really work in trying to deal with a problem unless we can prove that there is a problem. So we have to do them prevalence studies. So there's a lot of data analysis. There's lots of, sometimes it's physically going out and actually doing kind of inspections and investigating in a physical way. Sometimes it can be done. There's so many clever ways of doing this now. I mean, I've heard about a few things and I've touched on a few things. I mean, we've got data science is something now. We have a data science team, and so that's also something that we use. I know there's a system now where you can actually, from a satellite, beaming down to the sea, to the ocean, to the sea, you can see a boat. And by the way the boat's moving, you can tell generally if it's got carrying a cargo which is too big for the boat. And often that's a sign of slave labor. So there are some very clever things out there that can help. But data is key, and we have to be able to prove, we have to find a system that works, and then we have to be able to prove that there's a problem. Once we prove the problem, once we've got some measurements, we've got some numbers, we can then say, right, this is how we want to impact the numbers of this.
Thank you for listening to Cool Explorations. You've just heard David Pollendine of IJM, or International Justice Mission, which you can find at www.ijm.ca. And he's just been talking about the work that IJM does, how God's been using him in that work, and how IJM is really a tool for God to correct some of the wrongs that are going on in this world. And this is the first part in the series, so if you want to tune in tomorrow, you can catch the second part. If you would like to reach me for any reason, you can do so at tpeters745@gmail.com.